Hello, my name is Ricky Thomas, and my thesis is titled Don't Drink the Kool-Aid, an examination of abusive cult environments and recommendations for trauma victims. The intention of the paper was to examine the effects of abuse within cult environments on the human body and recommend forms of treatment, and it does so in a unique way by bridging the gap between the humanities and the sciences. I started out by asking the simplest question, what is a cult? And I came up with 4 different characteristics that allow us to separate the idea of a cult and what we deem a religion. And the first one is time, and according to Professor Ori Taver from the University of Pennsylvania, it is the most important because it takes time for a cult to establish itself within the religious landscape. The second is the message that is being put out. It is usually one that is aimed at a particular group of people or a minority. The third is the first generation of members. They're usually the most devoted because they are the first ones to buy into the group's message or cause. The fourth characteristic is the charismatic leader. This is someone who is able to promote their cause or their message and persuade people to join the group and actually get the whole thing started. For my example of a cult, I used the People's Temple, which was led by Jim Jones, and his message was basically the acceptance of all people, no matter the race or gender, and this is what he built his church off of in his home state of Indiana. And the first generation of people were obviously very devoted to him because he moved them from Indiana to California and then ultimately to Guyana, South America, where we see the Jonestown Massacre happen, which is where over 900 members of the People's Temple actually committed suicide by demand of Jim Jones himself. And here's a quick video on the Jonestown Massacre. It's actually quite graphic, so just a little bit of heads up.
Locked up by the temple leaders to make it difficult for anyone to leave the country along the premises. Jewelry, social security checks. A trunk was filled with performed today on the body of the founder of the People's Temple, Jim Jones. His sons were simply going to sleep. Some had pillows beneath their heads. Some died alone, separated by families until the end. Babies were fed the lethal potion with it. It's believed each lived about 5 minutes after swallowing a mixture of cyanide and a flavor. Custody by the Guyana police. Another arrest was made today of a member of the People's Temple, the man identified only as Tim Carter, the specific charges not immediately announced.
I then studied the Children of God cult, which was founded by David Berg back in 1959, and this group actually has ties all around the world, but they're most infamous for accounts of child sexual abuse as well as many other forms of abuse to children. Most of the abuse took place in these teen detention camps, formerly called teen training camps or Victor camps. This was because while the Children of God had a successful first generation and faithful one, the second one came along and began to question the faith. So by putting them in these camps, they felt it would be an incentive to make more positive contributions to the group and have more faith in it. And then I studied a woman named Mary Berg, who was actually the granddaughter of David Berg, the founder of the Children of God. And what she faced was isolation within the first 2 months. Once she was released, she was forced to do hard labor, pour concrete, break up concrete, cut grass with sickles, along with all the other children that were in these groups. And she was also beaten and sexually assaulted on multiple occasions. However, this is where the bridge between the humanities and the sciences connects within my presentation, because Mary actually had a mental breakdown or a psychological breakdown after enduring these abuses for 3.5 years. So now we're going to look more into how this trauma and this abuse affects the body. In looking into the nervous system, most of my information came from a woman named Shelley Rosen, who's a psychotherapist in New York who worked directly with cult members, and one of the effects is called autonomic dysfunction, which affects the autonomic nervous system, which could range from mild to actually life-threatening. This is whenever somebody who has experienced a traumatic event might have a flare-up and feel increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, increased body temperature, and increased blood pressure. And symptoms like these are present in people who suffer from PTSD, as these memories are recurring and the trauma returns in their head. They might experience that increased breathing. They might experience that increase in heart rate. In bringing up PTSD, there's also another form called CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, that seems to affect second-generation cult members more than the first. And some of these symptoms are specifically identity confusion and even more extreme forms of depression than the first generation members. And Rosen actually commented on how these illnesses become so severe for people who were former cult members, and this is because being in a cult isn't like a job. Being in a cult is something that goes on 24/7. Your life is dedicated to the group. And the People's Temple was a great example of this because their whole life revolved around building up Jonestown whenever they were in South America. It was focused all on the community. How could we benefit the community? How could we build it? And there was such a heavy focus on it that the only things that the people were reading were newspapers on what was going on in the community, or watching videos, or watching whatever form of media, and it was only concerned on what was going on in Jonestown. And even the kids who were in these teen training camps and the children who were part of the Children of God, their lives were focused on rebuilding their faith. There was nothing else to focus on because they were getting it beat into them and they were getting abused because of it. So their whole lives revolved around this. It's not like they were going home from a job and being able to relax, watch their own TV. So this constant pressure is what caused these illnesses to become so severe in former cult members. And Rosen actually provided statistics on PTSD in former cult members, as 61% of males and 71% of females reported that they suffered from some form of PTSD, and she compared that to military personnel, where only 10 to 25% of them reported suffering from some form of PTSD. So 61 and 71% compared to 10 to 25% in military personnel is quite astounding. Now we're going to look into how trauma affects the brain specifically, and there are 4 parts that seem to be affected the most. The first is the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC, which is in charge of our decision making, so the decisions we make for ourselves and the decisions we make for others. This is actually underactivated by trauma, along with the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC, which is in charge of our emotions and how we handle tough situations. The third is the amygdala, which is our fear center, so this triggers our fight or flight. And while the PFC and the ACC are underactivated, the amygdala is actually overactivated, so we're constantly on edge. And this is what forms what's called a bottom-heavy brain, as the amygdala is more towards the bottom, and the PFC and the ACC are more towards the top. So while the amygdala is overactivated and the PFC and the ACC are underactivated, it gets a bottom-heavy brain. And the fourth one is the hippocampus, which is also in charge of our emotions, similar to the anterior cingulate cortex, but there's a noticeable shrinkage in the actual hippocampus in somebody that has been affected by trauma. And that is very important to understand when we look into the treatment side of PTSD or trauma. And now we're actually going to look into some of the treatments, the first being a psychotherapeutic approach, the second being more of a pharmacological approach, and the third actually being a pharmacological approach as well. However, it is fairly new to psychiatric treatment. The first one is called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EDMR. This is the psychotherapeutic approach, and this is where the therapist holds an object or their finger or a bar of light in front of the person's nose and moves it from left to right, and the person is supposed to follow with their eyes, and they're told to replay the traumatic memory in their head over and over while the lighter object continues to move in front of their face, and they continue to follow it. And it's actually been found to make these traumatic memories less traumatic, and it has successfully treated over 1 million patients and is now being used in 19 studies all over the world. The second is the more pharmacological approach, which are phenytoin and paroxetine, which are actually 2 antidepressants used to combat symptoms of PTSD, and paroxetine has actually been shown to reduce PTSD symptoms by 54%. However, it what's important is it induces neurogenesis in the hippocampus, which means the hippocampus is actually able to grow whenever someone is on paroxetine. And like we talked about before, where due to trauma the hippocampus shrinks, the neurogenesis or the growth of the hippocampus is being induced by these antidepressants. So it's leading to successful treatment as the hippocampus grows. And the last one is also considered to be a more pharmacological approach, however, it's a little bit more taboo in our culture. It is the hallucinogen psilocybin, and what it does is it also induces the neurogenesis in the hippocampus, but while it connects to the 5-HT2A receptors within the brain, which is a part of the neurotransmitter serotonin, and psilocybin is able to bind to these transmitters and these receptors due to structural similarities. And one thing that is also interesting that I've recently found out is Johns Hopkins University is building a psychedelic and consciousness research center, which is going to be the first in the United States but second in the world, the Imperial College Psychedelic Research Center in England. And now for a quick video on psilocybin. And that is the end of the presentation. I want to say thank you to everyone who participated in helping me finish this thesis, and thank you to all who watched.